Can one set of universal rules, a single grand theory, really govern fairness everywhere? Or does who we are, where we live, and what we're doing fundamentally change what we owe each other?
That tension is, well, it's really the defining battleground of modern political philosophy. When we talk about justice, the crucial question is whether the principles that guide a global market can, or even should, be the same ones we apply at the kitchen table.
It's the difference between trying to use one philosophical key to open 1,000 different locks versus accepting that sometimes you just need a whole ring of keys.
Precisely. And that philosophical puzzle is exactly what we're unpacking in this deep dive.
We are jumping into a comprehensive critique of David Miller's philosophically rich and, I think, methodologically ambitious book, Principles of Social Justice.
And we believe that some books must be challenged. To do that rigorously, this critique uses a multifaceted approach. We apply a step-by-step critical thinking framework that maps claims to evidence, which is inspired by the methods of Richard Paul and Linda Elder.
And we also bring in an intellectual framework informed by the works of Mortimer J. Adler.
Then we escalate the challenge by using foundational ethical documents, specifically the Golden Rule and the U.S. preamble, to identify any ethical asymmetries. We then conclude with a logical analysis to arrive at a balanced conclusion for you.
Our mission is to assess not just what Miller claims, but how well those claims hold up under some really rigorous scrutiny.
And for those listening, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book critique. So let's get started. Maybe we can set the stage with the author himself.
Okay. David Miller is an English political theorist, and he's well known for defending what's called moderate liberal nationalism. His work is in direct conversation, or often direct opposition, with universalist figures like Rawls or Nozick.
Right. He specifically rejects their attempts to find that one single master principle to solve all problems of justice everywhere. He finds those theories just too abstract, too detached from the actual institutions and relationships that, govern our lives.
So what's his alternative?
Well, his central thesis, which is really the heart of the book, is that justice is inherently contextual. It has to be understood through a pluralist view, relying on three main principles: desert, need, and equality.
And this is where the ambition really comes in. It's not enough to just list three principles. Miller tries to systematize them. He actually maps them to different spheres of social relationships. He proposes a very clean typology.
He argues that the principles of justice change depending on the nature of the relationship. So take the spheres of markets and work roles where productivity and contribution are the main focus.
Okay.
Justice there, he says, should operate primarily on the principle of desert. This translates into a system of, controlled meritocracy. It rewards contribution.
Then you move into institutions focused on care, like the family or the public welfare system.
And here, the governing principle shifts entirely to need. This is where fundamental human well-being and basic welfare are addressed without any reference to contribution or merit.
Right. And the third one?
And finally, for the realm of citizenship and basic rights, the standard has to be pure equality. Equality of status, legal rights, and fundamental liberties for all members of the political community.
The theory is compelling because it tries to give credit to all our intuitions. We know markets should reward hard work, but we also know the sick and the poor deserve care simply for being human.
Exactly. But that neat division is what makes the argument so powerful, and it also brings us to our first major test, which is focusing on the quality of his evidence.
Because Miller stakes his claim on the idea that this mapping isn't just some philosophical construction. He says it's something ordinary people already intuitively use, and that empirical research supports this.
And that's fascinating because we have to step back and ask, is this a theoretical model based on intuitions, or is it a sociological model based on hard data? When we look at the evidence he cites, the social science surveys and opinion studies critics argue the data just does not strongly support such a clean three-way mapping.
So when researchers actually ask people about real-world scenarios, do their answers start to blur the lines?
Absolutely. Real moral judgments are much messier than the typology suggests. People often blend need and desert, or they apply equality in contexts Miller reserves for need. And the critique deepens when we look at the principle of desert itself. Miller's case for rewarding meritocracy, it leans more on thought experiments and reconstructed philosophical intuitions about individual responsibility, not so much on rigorous empirical evidence that seriously accounts for things like structural inequality or systemic barriers, or just the role of pure luck in determining outcomes.
This sounds like a philosophical chicken and egg problem. Is he describing how people are, or is he prescribing how they should be, and just using limited evidence to bolster that prescription?
That's exactly the logical trap we need to talk about. It introduces the classic risk of the naturalistic fallacy, the flawed inference from is to ought.
Okay, break that down for us.
Just because social science surveys suggest people have certain patterns of belief that the market does operate on desert, that doesn't logically prove the moral principle that markets should operate that way.
So the distinction is crucial. Empirical data gives us cautious knowledge about how people think, a sociological observation. But that observation is not a moral mandate. We have to separate what people believe from what is morally justifiable.
Precisely. If we move from the sociological data directly to the philosophical principle, we risk just rationalizing the status quo instead of subjecting it to real moral scrutiny. This is a point where the contextualist approach really shows some strain.
That structural separation between belief and moral principle is critical. Let's switch lenses now and apply our intellectual framework, an Adlerian test, to determine the epistemic status of Miller's claims. How far does this theory move from mere opinion toward knowledge and ultimately understanding?
Well, as we just established, the claims about what people actually believe regarding justice, they rest on limited survey data. So at best, this supports cautious knowledge, but it's knowledge only about patterns of lay opinion in specific contexts, not firm knowledge of universal human moral intuitions.
And what about the central claims, the ones about which principles are normatively correct? That desert must apply to markets. Where do those sit?
Those are philosophical opinions and strong arguments. They belong to practical truth. They are prescriptions for action, for designing institutions, not empirically demonstrable facts, and they're highly debatable, which is just the nature of political philosophy.
Okay, but despite these limitations, we have to acknowledge the book's achievement in understanding. Miller truly attempts to integrate three historically competing principles, desert, need, and equality, into one cohesive pluralist framework. That integration is a significant intellectual feat.
It is, but even here, the coherence is strained. Critics argue that the attempt to maintain this strict mapping of one principle per relationship type forces a rigidity onto a reality that is far more flexible.
Because real moral judgments show that overlap.
Right. And because of that overlap and conflict, the claim that Miller's framework uniquely fits our considered judgments is weakened. It's a powerful theoretical construction, but maybe a little too neat to capture the complexity of human justice.
This level of reflection and rational thought is exactly what we aim for. And for those of you who want to explore this level of analysis on other critical works, we encourage you to check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel, which offers AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts for deeper engagement.
Okay, so let's move to the ethical dimension and apply the acid tests of the Golden Rule in the U.S. preamble. Now, Miller's contextualism seems to respect the spirit of the Golden Rule within defined communities.
How so?
He argues for equal basic rights and a welfare state that allows citizens to participate fully, which ensures a degree of reciprocal respect and care among co-nationals.
But the philosophical rubber meets the road when we universalize the Golden Rule, the idea that you should treat others as you would wish to be treated, regardless of their borders.
And this is where Miller's moderate liberal nationalism comes in. He explicitly grants stronger, more extensive duties to compatriots than to outsiders.
And that is the source of the ethical instability. A universalized Golden Rule would treat all persons' fundamental needs as equally weighty. Miller's nationalism, by contrast, risks rationalizing existing global inequality simply by using national identity as the moral boundary line for who gets extensive care.
So if I accept that my neighbor in my own country deserves help based on need, why should the basic needs of someone in extreme poverty thousands of miles away be treated as fundamentally less weighty?
The answer Miller provides is that shared nationality provides a context of shared practices, institutions, and reciprocal political bonds that create special duties.
But for cosmopolitans, basic human needs transcend these bonds, meaning extensive duties have to apply globally. This asymmetry, strong duties inside, cautious duties outside, is perhaps the most controversial aspect of the book. It requires us to impartially consider whether nationhood is a moral boundary or just a practical convenience.
Let's apply the U.S. preamble as a heuristic civic benchmark to test the framework's broader societal implications. Let's start with the goal to form a more perfect union.
Miller's emphasis on social membership, on belonging and solidarity certainly strengthens internal cohesion. It gives people a strong, shared identity, which can make the welfare state sustainable.
Ah,
But that intense focus on national boundaries, which we just discussed, risks deepening global fragmentation and fostering that dangerous us versus them thinking, potentially making the global union less perfect.
okay, next, establish justice and promote the general welfare. Miller's framework supports a welfare state and equal basic rights for citizens, which is definitely promoting domestic welfare.
True, but his treatment of equality itself is widely critiqued as cautious, maybe even underdeveloped. Reviewers point out that his focus on need and desert lets him sidestep the harder questions of structural disadvantage.
So it leaves questions unanswered.
Exactly. It leaves unanswered how far a society must go to fundamentally remedy historical disadvantages, or exactly how much wealth redistribution is required to achieve genuine fairness. It supports welfare, but it stops short of addressing deep structural injustice.
And finally, secure the blessings of liberty.
By grounding core rights and the entitlements that make those rights meaningful, like welfare and citizenship, the framework risks tying fundamental liberties too closely to national membership.
Which challenges a more cosmopolitan reading of liberty.
Right, which would see it as a universal human status and a global entitlement. If your access to the blessings of liberty depends entirely on which side of a geopolitical border you were born on, well, that's a serious philosophical complication, especially when you consider stateless people or those forced to migrate.
That really puts the spotlight on the boundaries we draw. Okay, let's zoom out for our final logical analysis. What are the undeniable strengths of principles of social justice? Why does this book remain such a central text?
Well, methodologically, it's groundbreaking. Miller successfully challenges the assumption that one principle of justice has to govern all domains. He forces political theorists to move beyond pure abstraction and think concretely about institutional roles and social practices. That move away from the single principle idea is a major contribution.
And his respect for ordinary moral experience, for taking lay judgments seriously, resists that purely top-down theorizing that so often plagues abstract philosophy. It truly attempts to bridge high theory and the reality of social practice.
And his focus on belonging, citizenship, and shared practices also gives a rich, realistic account of social membership, highlighting why community matters for both political motivation and, frankly, the financial sustainability of welfare states.
But that core tension, the nationalist partiality, is inescapable.
It is the defining limitation. The claim that we owe more extensive duties to co-nationals than to humanity at large is philosophically controversial. It sits uneasily with fundamental commitments to universal human rights and global justice movements. This is the persistent critical issue that defines both his contribution and his critics.
Which brings us to the ultimate test of practical wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Does the framework truly serve the long-term flourishing and equal dignity of all human beings, especially across borders?
Miller achieves a high degree of understanding by integrating these principles, but his nationalism encodes a partiality that makes it challenging to extend that wisdom universally. The real lesson of the book is that constant tension between community-based obligations and universal human rights.
It demands that we rigorously justify which context we choose to operate within.
Exactly.
Before we wrap up, we do need to provide the necessary acknowledgement. The methodology for this analysis employed a systematic and precise framework, informed by established works on critical thinking and intellectual rigor.
And applying these multiple frameworks to a single philosophical work allows us to dissect the book's claims, its evidence, and its ethical implications all at once, ensuring a balanced and comprehensive assessment for you.
So what does this all mean for you? If justice is truly contextual, how do we prevent our definition of context, our borders, our communities, our institutions, from simply becoming a rationalization for our existing partiality? If the social sphere defines the duties, what exactly are our duties to those outside our defined spheres? That's something to mull over until next time.
A powerful, lingering question indeed.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.